with a mighty mustache.
Oh, that hurts. Why you doing that to my face? I hate you.
That's BillyCBoxing.com. Consider this your warning. Now back to Billy C. Interact with the show at BillyCBoxing.com.
And we're back. You're listening and watching the Billy C. Show. Glad you could be with us today, and as usual, we're glad to be with you. So, hey, don't forget, there's a new book out, and I need you to pick up a copy of it, and it's right here. It's Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, and joining us right now is the author of this book, Jeffrey Sussman, and I'd like to welcome him to the show. What's up, Jeff?
Hi, nice to have you. Glad to be here and glad to be speaking with you.
Hey, Jeff, Barney Ross was one of my favorite fighters. When I saw that this book came out, that was one of the things that interested me right away. First of all, what made you write the book? Why don't you give us a little history about why you chose to write this book and why you picked Barney Ross and Max Baer?
Well, when I was 12 years old, I was a skinny little kid, and my father was worried that bigger kids would pick on me. And my father was almost like an amateur boxer, and one day he brought home a pair of boxing gloves, a speed bag, a heavy bag, and a jump rope, and he set it up in our basement, and he taught me the elements of boxing. And after that, he knew Lou Stillman, who owned Stillman's Gym in the city. And he signed me up for 10 boxing lessons with a middleweight there. And I learned to box. And when my father was growing up, one of his close friends was a man named Abe Simon, who fought Joe Louis twice for the heavyweight title. He lost both times. I think it was 1940 and 1941. But my father grew up in a very anti-Semitic neighborhood, as did Abe Simon. And it was Abe Simon's boxing ability that would put an end to a lot of anti-Semitic attacks. So I became interested in Jewish boxers as well as boxing. In the late 1980s, I had as a PR marketing client a boxing promoter, and one of his clients was the welterweight boxer Howard Davis, and I got to promote him as well. And all of these circumstances combined to let me want to write a book about boxing, and I chose, because of my father's experiences, two boxers who were symbols against the anti-Semitism that was so prevalent in the 1930s.
You know, when you mention the promoter for Howard Davis, I promoted some of his fighters too. He's from Long Island, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, great guy. But anyway, you know, the impact that Jewish fighters had during the era of Max Baer and Barney Ross was a big one. There was a lot of Jewish fighters. It was popular. What kind of impact do you feel that the lack of Jewish fighters today has on the community? Do you think the interest in fighting for the Jewish community just left in terms of boxing, or do you think it was more important for them to fight? I mean, I don't understand why there had been such a drop-off with the amount of Jewish fighters, you know, in the pool of fighters to begin with. Can you explain that?
Well, you know, from 1910 to 1941, there were 628 Jewish boxers, and about 24 of them became champions in various weight classes. But just about all of them, with the possible exception of Max Baer, they were the children of poor immigrants, and it was a way to earn a living and earn some money, a lot of money, very quickly, certainly a lot more money than their parents were earning. You know, if your father worked in a garment center and he was making $5 a week, and you could make $50 a night fighting, obviously fighting was a lot more remunerative than working in a garment center. But a lot of these boxers were also concerned that, you know, they might suffer head injuries or things like that. And most of them got out of boxing after 5 or 7 years. of working at it. And though a lot of their children were interested in boxing and wanted to become boxers, the parents really dissuaded them. Max Baer Jr. told me a very cute story about his desire to want to be a boxer. When he was in college, he asked his father to teach him the elements of boxing. And he and his father went into the backyard of their home, and they put on these big, puffy boxing gloves so they wouldn't hurt each other. And the father said to him, "Look, I don't want you to become a boxer, but I'll teach you what the elements of boxing are. And we're not going to hurt each other. We're not going to punch each other in the face or anything. But I'll just teach you how to feint, how to jab, how to block." And Max Baer Jr. said, "Fine." But as this was going on, Max Baer Jr. got a little carried away and threw a punch at his father right in the face and as hard as he could. Next thing Max Baer Jr. knew, he's lying on the ground looking up at the sky. His father had knocked him unconscious, and it was just an automatic reaction. Max Baer Jr.'s mother was hanging out of a second-story bedroom window, and she said, "What have you done? What have you done? You've killed my son." But Max Baer Jr. said that ended his boxing career. His father just did not want him to become a boxer. I think it would be very good if there were more Jewish boxers today. I did a talk at a place called the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Glen Cove on Long Island. And a Jewish boxer showed up in support of me, a guy named Cletus Selden, who is a lightweight, and he's a terrific boxer. I mean, he's young in his career. He's only had 17 fights, but he's had 17 wins, 16 by knockouts. And he was a big hit with the audience. They absolutely loved him. But on the other hand, I was invited to give a talk at another Jewish organization, and they decided not to have me because the women in the organization said, "Well, there's no such thing as a Jewish boxer. Why should we have them talk about Jewish boxing?" So it's a shame in many ways that Jewish boxing has kind of faded away. Though I get a lot of messages from the children and grandchildren of Jewish boxers who say how much they enjoyed reading my book, and it brings back memories and stories that they heard from their parents and grandparents. And they, too, are upset that there aren't any more Jewish boxers around.
Yeah, I just never could understand why they stopped. I mean, even going back to the bare knuckle times, we got a live chat room right now. One of the guys that's in there a lot from Strictly Business Boxing, and my man Coach, he reminded me, Daniel Mendoza, which was a famous bare knuckler, was I think he's the first Jewish world champion. You know, so there was so many, and all of a sudden it stopped. Yeah. Selden, he's the Hebrew Hammer, right? Yeah. So, but there's so few of them today. It's a shame, and it's the same, really. You know, I'm of Italian descent, and there was so many Italian fighters. They used to be, and I think that some of it today is because we've become so politically correct. Back in the day, in the 40s and the 50s, well, actually before that, between the 30s and the 50s, they used to have these rivalries, and you would have Italians against the Jewish knight, or you know, Irish against the Italians, and you know, promoters would be able to sell, and you'd bring people in, and you'd have the Italian fighters fighting the Jewish fighters, and so on and so forth, and it would be a success. Today, could you imagine, Jeff, if a promoter tried to do that today, they would be criticized, and it's a shame because I think the sport is hurting from it. What do you think?
I agree. It's become so politically correct that you can't promote an ethnic rivalry. You know, if you did have a Jewish fighter against an Italian fighter or an Irish fighter or a Hispanic fighter, you'd have to play up the ethnic rivalry in such a subtle way that people wouldn't even notice it, because if you did it directly, the media would come down on you as being racist and other things. So that's kind of unfortunate, but certainly, you know, the great ethnic rivalries of the 1930s what drew an enormous number of people to boxing. When Barney Ross fought Jimmy McLarnin, it was a Jew against an Irishman, and they brought out their respective audiences. Yeah, it had a tremendous number of Irish American fans and a tremendous number of Jewish American fans who would attend those bouts, and they loved it.
Yeah, well, you know what? A lot of the fans are missing that today because everybody's so afraid to basically. I mean, and just by saying, it's the Jews against the Italians isn't knocking anybody. I mean, but we're so afraid today. But let's talk a little about Barney Ross. I focus on him because, like I said to you in our correspondence plus earlier, he's one of my favorite fighters. And not only did I think he was a great fighter in the ring, but he overcame so many odds, and they eventually. A lot of people know him as a wartime hero. Tell us a little about Barney.
Well, Barney was a very interesting guy. He came from an Orthodox Jewish family, and his father actually at one point wanted him to become a rabbi. And Barney wasn't particularly interested. And his family was very poor. His father operated a little tiny grocery store in an area of Chicago called the Maxwell Street Ghetto, which was a Jewish ghetto in Chicago. And one day, two holdup men came in and shot and killed his father. And that was the end of Barney's interest in anything having to do with religion. And he began running with a local gang in Chicago. And his close friend in that gang was a kid named Jacob Rubenstein, who eventually took on the name Jack Ruby. And we know him today as the man who shot President Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. And both of them worked for Al Capone. They were runners for Al Capone's bookie joints. And Al took an interest in them. And he said to Jacob Rubenstein, you have the makings of a gangster. But he said to Barney, you don't. He said, but I've seen you in a lot of your street fights, and I think that you could become a good boxer. And after Barney's father was shot, his mother had a nervous breakdown, and his three siblings were all put in different foster care homes. And it was Barney's ambition to reunite his family, to be able to buy a home and bring his mother out of the mental institution and to reunite his siblings all in one house. And Al Capone was sympathetic to that. He said, well, I'll get you a trainer and you'll begin to have fights. And when you start fighting, I'll make sure that every ticket to every fight you have is sold, because Barney would get a portion of the proceeds from those ticket sales. And that happened eventually. And he was able to buy a house and to reunite his family. And he was what they called, some people called in those days, a scientific fighter, in that he was very smart. He would understand what the strategy was of his opponents, and he would develop his own strategy for overcoming that. And he was just a fierce and very clever boxing opponent. And his three matches with Jimmy McLarnin were absolutely historic. Barney won the first one. He lost the second one, and he won the third one. But Jimmy McLarnin's manager didn't believe that Barney should have been awarded the decision in the third one, and he went to court to have it overturned. And his reason for it is he said that one of the judges was Jewish, and that Jack Dempsey, who was the referee, had a Jewish grandmother, and therefore he couldn't be trusted. And the judge threw the case out of court, and Barney retained the win. Eventually, he lost his title to a fabulous welterweight named Henry Armstrong, who was probably the inspiration for Sugar Ray Robinson. And after that fight, Barney retired, and he opened what we call today a sports bar in Chicago. That became a hangout for athletes and politicians and some mob guys. And when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, Barney wanted to enlist in the Marines. I think he was about 32 years old at the time, and they told me he was too old to join the Marines. But through his various connections in Chicago, he was able to get that overturned, and they finally accepted him into the Marines. And during basic training, they would refer to him as Grandpa. And at one point, he had an officer who said something anti-Semitic to him, and Barney flattened the guy. And after that, he had a choice of if he was staying stateside or being sent overseas. And he demanded to be sent overseas. He wanted to fight the Japanese. He felt that America had been very good to him and had helped him and his family ultimately. And he wanted to fight the enemy that he thought was trying to destroy America. And so he went to Guadalcanal, and one night he was out on a patrol with three other Marines. and they were ambushed by a Japanese platoon. Two of the Marines were immediately killed, and the third one was wounded, and Barney threw him into a ditch and jumped in on top of him. All through the night, the Japanese were firing on them, and Barney took his rifle and the 3 rifles of his fallen comrades and fired back at the Japanese all through the night. When he ran out of ammunition, he started throwing hand grenades. There were 24 hand grenades between the 3 soldiers, and Barney threw all of them. It turned out in the morning that he had completely wiped out this Japanese platoon. But he was also badly wounded, and he didn't initially know that because he was so involved in the fighting that was going on. But when he was taken back to base, they discovered that he had a bad wound in his thigh and a bad wound in his foot. And he was sent to a hospital where he had several surgeries. But to deal with the pain of those surgeries, they gave him quite a bit of morphine. And as a result of that, he became a morphine addict. And though that didn't stop him from getting the Silver Star, which was awarded to him in the Rose Garden at the White House by President Roosevelt. Eventually, due to his drug addiction, Barney hit bottom, and he couldn't deal with it anymore, and he put himself into a federal drug rehabilitation center in Lexington, Kentucky. And they told him it would take a year for him to become completely clean. But he was so determined, he did it in 6 months. And he spent the rest of his life lecturing to high school and college students about the dangers of drugs. Now, the actor John Garfield had contracted with Barney to make a movie about his life. But when he discovered that Barney was, or had been, a drug addict, he decided that he would fictionalize the story. And so he made a great boxing movie, which is based on the life of Barney Ross. It's called Body and Soul. And because they didn't give Barney the credit that he was supposed to get, and didn't give him any of the financial benefits that he should have received, he wound up suing the production company, and they settled out of court for something like $65,000, which was a lot of money in 1947. And then in 1951, another movie was made about him that dealt honestly with his drug addiction. It was called Monkey on My Back, and it starred an actor named Cameron Mitchell. That movie isn't as well known, however, as Body and Soul, which I just saw recently, and I think it's a great movie.
You know, the story, the World War II story with Barney Ross always reminded me, his actions reminded me of Audie Murphy and some of the things that he did.
Right.
And another thing that and maybe I'm wrong thinking this, but I remember learning about Barney Ross, and at the time, you know, a lot of these war guys that were given morphine to deal with the pain, when they came back to the States to get them unhooked on morphine, they were giving them heroin. They didn't know what the perils with heroin were. And wasn't that what Barney Ross eventually was addicted to, or was he always addicted to morphine?
It was heroin. He became a heroin addict.
Right.
And he went through all of his money. It was just, what happened to him after the war was just a terrible tragedy.
Yeah.
But he came back from it, which was amazing, because it showed his inner strength, the same kind of inner strength that made him such a formidable boxing opponent.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's why he's one of my favorites. We're running out of time, Jeff. I just wanted to ask you one more time about today's fighters. I mean, obviously, we can't compare them to the eras of Max Baer and of course Barney Ross. But you know, do you think that there's anything based on the way society has changed that has derailed the interest in you know, Jewish fighters to turn pro or even get into the ring? I mean, do you think it has anything to do with that? Or I mean, you know, every other group seems to have stayed with it to a degree, except for the Jewish community. I just can't put my finger on it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I just think that they found, you know, better ways of making a good living. And not that I'm one of them, but certainly a lot of the Jewish children of boxers were encouraged to become doctors and lawyers and dentists and accountants and film producers or whatever. It was just an easier thing to do. But it was amazing to me the enthusiasm that existed for for Jewish boxers during the heyday of Jewish boxing. And when I think of, my own boyhood and the stories that my father told me about the Jewish boxers and the Jewish boxers that I met who were training at Stillman's gym, it's a world that's long gone, and I'm sorry that it is gone. I wish it would come back.
I think you put it in great perspective when you said that a lot of women said there's no such thing in the group that you were speaking or going to speak in front of, said, oh, there's no such thing as Jewish boxers. And that's such a comical statement for me, because there were so many of them, during this era, and it's a shame. But I certainly can see why. I mean, it's the same evolution of sorts with every group that comes and chooses to try and find a better way out. I know what Italians did it, Germans did it, Irish did it. It's just it's a shame that we don't have it today. I guess it's a bittersweet, because on the good side, there's better opportunities for everyone today than there was yesteryear. But the bad side is we've lost that rivalry, and I think that rivalries is what made boxing so great during these eras, and it's something that the young fans of today just don't understand. They don't see it, and promoters are afraid to say it, so it could never return, right?
I agree with you, and there's also a thing with the media. I mean, the media doesn't. The sports people on television, the sports reporters, and big newspapers like the New York Times don't even cover boxing anymore. When I was researching my book, I went back and I looked at old copies of the New York Times, and there would be front page banner headlines about the new heavyweight boxing champion. The only stories that the Times does about boxing is if it's a big money fight, like the Mayweather fight. They covered that only from the point of view of the business story, but not from a sports story. They won't even touch it as a sports story.
No, they used to have, every newspaper in the country used to have a boxing reporter, a guy that just focused on boxing. The last one that was the last full-time boxing reporter, which he's not even doing it full-time anymore for the Daily News, I believe was Tim Smith. I think he was the last one. So it just goes to show you how quickly that's changed. Where can everyone get a copy of your book, Jeff?
They can get a copy of Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
Well, it's a great read, and Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time and stopping by with us today, and I hope that we can get you back on in the future to talk some historical aspects of the Jewish fighters of yesteryear. I think our viewers and listeners should learn about that.
Well, my next book, which I've just about finished writing, is a biography of Rocky Graziano. So
there you go. Hey, we'll bring a paisan on for you.
Yeah, we'll get into Italian boxing.
Hey, that's right up my alley, my man. So
I'm sure
that'll be good. But listen, I appreciate the time, and we'll look forward to you next time. All right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care. Get a copy of Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing. You heard right from the author, Jeffrey Sussman said you can get a copy Barnes & Noble or Amazon. Pick it up. It's a great read. If you haven't heard of Barney Ross or Max Baer, you're missing out. And I know I didn't give Max Baer enough coverage here during the interview, but that's because I love Barney Ross. I can't deny that. I mean, he was one of my favorite fighters. I mean, every time people start talking to me, and I always say that I thought that Barney Ross was one of the greatest lightweights of all time. And you guys, at the end of the year, when we talk about all-time greats, and some fighters go up or down on our lists, Barney Ross is always there for me. So and the story, I was just when Jeffrey was telling us the story about what got Barney Ross into boxing, I was just recently talking to someone, and they didn't know about him seeing his father take the bullets in his chest in the grocery store, in their family-owned grocery store, which was a big impact on a young Barney Ross, and it was an impact on me. It was one of the first books that I read, not this book because it just came out, but another one on Barney Ross, and it really got me into that era, and it opened up the floodgates, and I think it would do the same for you. So get a copy of Jeffrey Sussman's book as soon as you can. Listen, we're going to be talking about some other news that's in the sport right now, and specifically, you know how we've been talking about good fights, and it doesn't necessarily mean a fight against a champion or along those lines. Well, there is some fights that are coming up that I really want to talk about, but we're going to take a short little break here, and when I get back, I'll have Sal with me, and we will talk about a couple of fights that I want you guys to know that I think is a good fight. It's not a glamour fight. It's not going to be a fight against two guys with undefeated records, but it's going to be a very competitive fight. And I also want to talk about some of the other things that we were talking about yesterday with Star Boxing and their blueprint. And, well, they're at it again, basically. So bear with me. I will take a short break. And when I come back, I'll have Sal Rocky Senecola, and we'll have a discussion about some news. So don't go nowhere. So we'll be back in 2.